Okay, welcome and good day to everyone around the world and thank you for joining the IELTS Expert Forum on English or English linguistics around the world. In this new series, we'll talk about what it's like working in different countries, what the English linguistics landscape is like, just basically having conversation with people who work in different parts of the world. Today, we'll talk about what it's like working in Australia and Japan. My name is Schweinberger. I'm lecturer in applied linguistics in Australia. And with me are Laurence Anthony. He's professor at Waseda University in Japan. He's in the tech space. He's famous for developing the AntConc software tools. He's working in science communication in his position at Waseda. And also with us today is Peter Crosthwaite. Peter Crosthwaite has specialized on, he's a colleague of mine at the University of Queensland, and he specialized on corpus linguistics and basically combining or using corpora in language learning and teaching. So for example, data-driven learning and basically using data to enhance language learning and teaching. So welcome everybody, and I'd like to hand over just real quick to Laurence and Peter and ask them to introduce themselves.
Should I start?
Yeah.
Okay, so hey everybody, thank you for coming this evening. It's 7 o'clock here in Brisbane time. I should say that even though I work at Waseda University in Japan, I'm actually currently on sabbatical at University of Queensland in Australia, working with Peter and Martin, which has been really great. So I have been in Japan for over 30 years. Originally was working in the west of Japan at a university called Yokohama University of Science, and then I moved to Waseda University in 2004. Again, into a faculty of science and engineering. So basically all my work has been focused on science communication related related to writing, presentation skills, and so on. So in that sense, I haven't really focused on linguistics in its more traditional form. I've been mostly interested in science communication, technical writing, English for specific purposes, and that kind of work. In my job right now, I'm coordinating or part of a team who are coordinating a quite large science communication program for 10,000 students going from first year undergraduate to PhD level. Of course, my research is related to corpus linguistics and vocabulary, which is where the linguistics aspect comes in perhaps more. And I can talk a little bit about that. And as you'll learn later in this discussion, a lot of linguists or people interested in English language would not actually be working in a department of linguistics or a faculty of linguistics in Japan, and many would be in the same situation that I'm in. So it's not uncommon. I'll pass over to Peter.
Yep, so I'm Peter, originally from the UK, and started my career 20 years ago as a TESOL instructor in South Korea, where I was there for over 6 years. I then moved to University of Cambridge in the UK to do an MPhil and then PhD in English linguistics. I did a corpus study, like contrastive corpus work, Mandarin and Korean corpus data and English as well. Then I took up a assistant professorship at the University of Hong Kong in the Center for Applied English Studies, working under Professor Ken Highland. So within that center, the main focus is on English for academic purposes, English for specific academic purposes as well. So at the time was kind of one of the world leading centers for disciplinary discourses and the use of corpus linguistics to identify the key expressions and vocabulary that would be used within those disciplines. That's where I also really got into using corpora to help with the language teaching that I was doing through the direct use of learners having hands-on use of corpora, what's currently known as data-driven learning as a pedagogical approach. So I spent 3 years there, and then in 2017 I came to the University of Queensland in Australia, where I've been kind of program coordinator for a while now of the main applied linguistics program here, mostly dealing with mainland Chinese students, looking at the Masters of Applied Linguistics in TESOL, and more recently a Masters of Applied Linguistics in Language and Discourse Analysis. So my main research areas are corpus linguistics. I started off doing learner corpus linguistics, then got more involved in corpus analysis of academic English. These days I still kind of work on those, but also look at the use of generative AI and the language that's produced by generative AI as well, looking at that from a kind of corpus linguistic perspective. So that's it from me, and I think now we'll hand over to Tim for the questions.
Yeah, so one of the things that got me to want to talk about what it's like working in English linguistics or around the world was that I experienced a culture shock when I moved to Australia, because coming from Germany, typically you have English departments. And in English departments, you have people who focus on literature and culture, people who do language practice and English linguistics. What is different just in terms of department structures or where your position is located? I'd like to start with Peter and then move on to Laurence to just basically talk about what the organizational structure, how it is embedded in other in the departments.
Yeah, I think certainly in our school, and I think it's also the case in other universities in Australia as well, is that applied linguistics is treated rather distinctly from linguistics. So that's an initial, in terms of the school's organizational structure, we have kind of research clusters at the moment in our school. And my kind of research cluster does not fall under linguistics. It falls under the second language studies cluster. So I'm in the linguistics cluster, but kind of on the day-to-day work, I do very little work with them. Applied linguistics as well is mostly primarily focused on postgraduate level teaching, with linguistics having not actually a huge kind of teaching footprint in the university. But almost all of the work that is done in linguistics is on Indigenous languages and fieldwork-based studies. So the lecturers within the linguistics department essentially work on grants, and then those grants allow them to go and look at various topics related to Indigenous languages, around dictionaries and around language revitalization. There's a great emphasis on conversation analysis and on kind of documenting the linguistics of Indigenous language through conversation analytic approaches. And that's pretty much the work of the linguistics team. They did, and then obviously they've done some work with Martin with the corpus linguistics level as well. There's a few people who work on phonetics and phonology as well, again, primarily of Indigenous languages. And a lot of the government grants are for any kind of work in linguistics are in that area. So I think then if you move on to like applied linguistics and looking at the status of English linguistics across not just the university level, but within the education system as well. Obviously, Australia is a huge base for systemic functional linguistics. This is led primarily by, in New South Wales at the University of Sydney, people like David Rose, people who like Jim Martin and so on, who they really kind of push systemic functional linguistics approaches into the primary and secondary curricula, where anything language related is kind of framed. If you look at the Australian curriculum and the way that the assessments and the way that the curriculum and the way the language around the assessments and the curriculum are framed, it's all pretty much taken from the systemic functional linguistics playbook. So there's a lot of work in that area. And then I guess I do supervise students who want to work on that. I've published a number of papers on systemic functional linguistics with students together, but I do not in any way consider myself a functional linguist, but I think it just comes with the territory if you're here in Australia. So I think hopefully that's provided a bit of an overview of where we are with relation to the world of English linguistics in Australia, certainly within the context here at the University of Queensland. And I'm pretty confident in my current role as the editor-in-chief of the Australian Review in Applied Linguistics. I also sit on the executive team for the Australian Association of Applied Linguistics. So it's kind of a pretty good overview of where Australian institutions are more generally.
Yeah, I just translate for people who have a German background or Central European background. In linguistics in Australia can be better translated not as linguistics but as allgemeine Sprachwissenschaften, general linguistics. So what in Central Europe, continental Europe would be general linguistics, in Australia would be linguistics. And what people do in English linguistics or German linguistics would be more akin to applied linguistics. Laurence, what is it like in Japan? Because you're actually not in a linguistic department either, or a English department either, right? Or
That's right.
Structure of your job? What's it like?
Okay. So I'll speak briefly about my own position, which is perhaps a little bit unusual, and then I'll talk a bit about what a lot of people would be, the situation or the structure that a lot of people would be in. So I've always worked in science and engineering, and so I'm in the Faculty of Science and Engineering in a Center for English Language Education in Science and Engineering. So it's a communication program, science communication program. So in that sense, I'm not in an English department. I'm not in a linguistics department. I'm, in fact, in the science and engineering faculty where all students are interested in science and engineering and not particularly interested in English or linguistics at all. So our daily jobs would be to address their needs, for science and engineering needs, which is where you lead into ESP and that kind of work. But interestingly, I'm not in an unusual position in many respects, because if you look at the landscape in Japan, a lot of linguists or applied linguists would be in a similar situation. So you'll find that some linguists or applied linguists will be in a center like mine. I'm in the Faculty of Science and Engineering, but you might find them in nursing or tourism or dentistry or some other very specialized area. They're in a specialized university or a specialized department, and they're in a center that's basically designed to address the needs of that target audience. Or they're going to be in a more general humanities kind of department or faculty. So you'll find people would be in a faculty of humanities or arts and humanities, and they might be in a department of American and English language and culture, or a department of communication or English communication or foreign culture and communication, some kind of broad name that covers a broad range of disciplines or areas. So what you'll commonly, and then you'll find a few very niche groups which would actually be a linguistics department or language and linguistics. But generally, people are going to be in these kind of broader areas where they're going to be in a team that would comprise not only of linguists, but they would have like pure linguists that would only be interested, for example, in looking at generative grammar and so on. You might find some applied linguists who are interested in TESOL, TEFL, and they might include corpus linguists. But you also might find in the same group, you'll have French teachers, German teachers, just straight on French, German language teachers. You might even find people doing psychology, all kinds of things in this group. And they're all kind of covering all these core subjects, this kind of basic liberal arts, the basic courses in liberal arts that all Japanese students have to take. So in the first 2 years of Japanese university, they all take this broad range of subjects covering things like psychology, general English, broad range, and French and German as well. And the teachers covering those classes would all be in one group. So in that sense, even we're pretty special because we have this science communication focus, very, very narrowly focused. But within my own group, we have linguists, applied linguists, corpus linguists, psycholinguists, and others. So quite a broad range of people in a single group.
Yeah. Before, I think that's quite a kind of interesting, right? To really see where the differences are in the different systems. Before I continue with talking about the systems and how you basically get your positions, because that also differs across countries, I'd like to ask you about your cohort, because Laurence, you touched on that already. If you would describe your student cohort, or people who are enrolled in English linguistics or English study courses, what would the students be like? Who would they be?
Okay, so again, my situation's a little bit special because I'm in science and engineering. So my students are all in science and engineering, 17 different departments, ranging from architecture, mathematics, physics, chemistry, biology, and that's it. But we cover this kind of broad range of subjects, and every university in Japan has the same idea. So the students that you'll get generally, if you're in a faculty or department of, say, American and English language and culture, so you'll have basically mostly humanities students, but they may not be interested in linguistics. They may be taking law, for example, or something else. And they're going to take a range of classes in their first 2 years. So they're, in some sense, their motivation or interest in linguistics and language might be low. So you often have a case of people talking about the lack of motivation from the students to take the classes. And in my case, for example, if we don't tailor to their specific needs, they are not interested at all in language or linguistics. So we really have to address the needs of the students that we have.
But most of them are Japanese, right?
Most of the students are Japanese. I'd say 95% of the students would be Japanese, although our university, Western University, is pretty well known for having a quite large group of international students joining us. And we teach all our classes in English, but you would find that some universities will basically teach all these liberal arts courses in Japanese. And even the language classes might be taught predominantly in Japanese as well. So just the content itself would be in English, and all the explanation around it would be in Japanese. One thing I would say, though, is that Japanese as a people have a strong desire to study. They have an interest in language. They have an interest in travel and overseas and different cultures and so on. So in that respect, there's a lot of they may not be motivated to study the specific course that we're teaching, but generally, Japanese students are good. They do like study, and they want to study, and they do their homework, and they're pretty good. So it's a matter of basically addressing their needs in the courses that we teach, but that can be quite different from the research and other work that we're doing. So if we're talking about linguistics and language, that might be actually just a research focus, whereas a teaching focus might be really like general English language teaching.
Before I hand over to Peter, I have one quick question as a follow-up, maybe. If someone wants to be an English teacher in Japan, right? How would their curriculum, or what would their curriculum look like?
So they would go into a Department of Education, probably. They want to be an English teacher, right? So they're going to a Department of Education. They in the first 2 years, they still take a broad range of subjects across. Maybe they have to take English classes and German and some psychology classes and various geography and various different liberal arts, basic courses in mathematics, things like that in IT and so on. Regardless of where they're going, all students end up doing something similar, and then they would specialize. So in the third and fourth year of university, in undergrad, third and fourth year, then they would start taking specific courses in education theory and curriculum design and maybe a few specialized courses in English language, but probably not. Probably they're going to focus mostly on education. Yeah.
I think when it comes to student cohorts, that is something that really struck me as being very different from what I experienced in Germany. Peter, can you tell us more about what the student cohort is like in applied linguistics in Australia?
Yeah, no problem. So again, I think going back to the graduate split, with undergraduate, they get a lot of domestic Australian students and a range of international students from many different countries. They'll take courses in introductory English linguistics. a lot of them take it as part of more applied subjects. So I think the big thing that keeps kind of our linguistics team afloat teaching-wise is the speech and language therapy programs. These degrees require students take courses in like the foundations of English linguistics so that they've got that meta language to then be able to explain to patients later on about some of the things that are happening from the speech and language side and the clinical side of things. So that's the undergraduate. But again, all of my current work is focused on postgraduate work. And it's pretty much the case, is very, very common in Australian universities that you will get very, very, very few domestic Australian students. We're talking single figures, and almost all the student cohort will be international students. Now, due to kind of geographic locations, financial considerations, almost the overwhelming majority of our student cohort is from mainland China. This is good. We love our Chinese students. They're really fantastic people, but it causes a number of issues. One of these issues is, first of all, the diversity of the student cohort is a problem in that they're almost all from one country, which can cause issues for kind of students who are not from there, feeling like they're not really getting a kind of the experience that they thought that they signed up for when they signed up for that originally. The other then is on the kind of general language background, or at least the English proficiency of the students who are coming through. So kind of like the minimum qualification, language qualification to enter master's degree program would be like a 5.5 at IELTS, and then they take some bridging English courses to get them up to the required standard so that they can enroll on the programs. Another cohort who just come straight in at like IELTS 6.5 and so on. And they may increasingly we're receiving students without necessarily a good background in English linguistics or English language teaching and learning. So we find that it can be very challenging to tailor quite, master's degree level courses on even introductory concepts in applied linguistics, but have to balance that kind of advanced level research of English linguistics with some of the linguistic and educational background issues with some of the cohort. But that said, we get some of the absolute, our best students for the dissertation that come through with high GPAs are also from China. So it's like a real mix of students who perform incredibly well and who will go on to have very, wonderful careers in applied linguistics, but then probably a whole heap of other students that it can be very challenging to work with. But I mean, it's just that the current market, the market hasn't always been that way. I think we used to be a lot more diverse, probably like 10 years ago. But just the nature of the international education market in Australia is dominated by China. They have by far the largest number of international students that send across. They have other countries still, in terms of the level of scholarships available in their government programs, are still incredibly small compared with the financial power of the Chinese international students. So I think that will not change for a number of years in the foreseeable future.
I have a quick follow-up question. It's the same question that I asked Laurence. If someone wants to become an English teacher in Australia, what would they study?
Okay, so to become an English teacher at a private language institute, they would take our degree, Masters in Applied Linguistics, and then go on, and that qualification will get them those positions fairly well. If they want to join the public school system as an English teacher, there are a number of options. So one, they could go through with a Master of Applied Linguistics from ours and go into what's called the English for an Additional Language or Dialect stream of teaching. It's called EALD. And essentially that works as a kind of sub-component of mainstream classes, and not just in English, but in all other subjects as well. So like math, science, humanities, and so on. And the second language students within those cohorts would then take additional tutorials and teaching at different class times with teachers who second language work on second language specific teaching, and they'll generate teaching materials and curricula that are there to support the English language component of the subject topic or the subject content knowledge that they're dealing with week or that month or for that particular examination. So that's one way into the school system. The other would then be maybe to take a degree in a master's in applied linguistics and then take a short master's of teaching, because the master's of teaching is then recognized by the Queensland government as an accredited teaching qualification. So a number of our students do that. They'll go and do 2 years with us, and then they'll go and do another year at either our Department of Education, or they'll choose another Australian university where maybe the fees are lower, and then they can take that 1 year or a kind of expedited program to help them get that teaching accreditation. And then as soon as they got work rights to work in Australia, they can go straight then into the public school system at primary or secondary, depending which specialization they decided to take.
Just real quick, very quick, because also it struck me as being very odd when I came over from Germany, because here students in Germany, they pay very little to study. Let's say around, let's say 500 euros, like 750 Australian dollars per year. What would the average student pay in Australia for a year of study?
I think the average student pays something in the region of 12,500 Australian dollars per year of study. They kind of charge them per course, and they'll generally take 8 courses in a year. The way that the fees can be reduced is if you have recognized prior learning. So if you have a relevant degree in English language, English literature, business English, these kind of relevant degrees, you can then take a shorter program, typically 1.5 years instead of the full 2. For those with significant professional experience and relevant degree, they can also get on and do the master's in just a year. But recently the government kind of changed things whereby if you want to stay longer in Australia, you need to be on the 2-year program. So a lot of students now who even do have the relevant kind of background and qualifications are choosing to do the longer program simply because that's the pathway for them to gain work rights in Australia in the future. And that's a lot of the reason maybe why a student might come to study in Australia, regardless of whether they're doing applied linguistics or another subject. But typically we will have a number of people every year who study applied linguistics in Australia, not because they particularly care about English linguistics, but they might be good at English and they want to come and live and work in Australia, and that's a pathway to do so.
Yeah. What about Japan, Laurence? Do you have student fees, and what would they be like?
Well, there's two big. If we talk about universities, there's basically 2 types. There's a private and public universities. Public universities are traditionally a little bit cheaper than private universities. Probably looking at about is that right? 800,000? No, 8,000. I need to figure out how it would be. 13,000. So 8,000 Australian dollars, roughly 9,000. Yeah, 9,000 Australian dollars per year, whereas a private university would be around what Peter was just saying, about 13,000, 14,000 dollars a year, Australian dollars a year for studying there.
8,000 Australian dollars would be about 5,000 euros, just as a benchmark.
Yeah, but it does depend quite a lot on what subject you're studying. As if we're talking about, for example, a language and culture kind of, or communication kind of program, that would be what you're looking at. If you're doing something like science and engineering, it would be much more like 15,000, 16,000 a year. What's interesting, based on what Peter was just saying, though, is it's interesting how his focus is a lot on the international students coming and how they would, what they would be doing, and and the visa aspect and so on. Whereas in Japan, it's almost solely Japanese students. So we really focus on the local the local students. We do have international students come, but they would be coming either fully paid from, because it's like my university is a private institution, so they would be they would have to pay themselves the same what we're just talking about. And they would be fully funded by some government program. And they are less of a concern in terms of funding than our local students, who would be basically paid, their parents would be paying for most of their study or through a scholarship or some kind of local universities, local Japanese scholarship scheme. We would have students coming on that, and there would be either loans or there would be some kind of paid scholarship.
I have two questions to follow up on that, because the student bodies are extremely different, right? Also, when I compare that to Germany,
Yes.
they're very, very different, because in Germany, we also have a majority of domestic students, and international students would be a minority. What about staff? Because that's also quite different in Australia, right? What percentage of your staff is not domestic in English language and linguistics? What would you reckon?
You're speaking to me?
Oh, me first?
Yeah, you first.
Generally speaking, most students and most faculty are all Japanese, but in this area of applied linguistics, language and culture, you'll find quite a variety of ratios. Some universities would still be predominantly Japanese. In ours, we probably have about 70% of non-Japanese. So, but that's because of the nature of the discipline. If we cross borders into another discipline, you'll find 95% are Japanese faculty. But because it's related to language, and we have French, German teachers, or basically people who have studied overseas are going to find it easier to get a position. We haven't talked about actually getting positions, but it will. When we come on to that, you'll sort of know a little bit more about why the faculty is going to lean towards international scholars. But I would say in our group, for example, we have about 70% which are international faculty. But I would say most universities, most departments would probably be Japanese predominantly members.
What about our group, Peter?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's hard to say. Well, it's hard to actually define domestic Australian, right? Because it's an incredibly multicultural country. So it's kind of impossible to say what that means. I mean, we're not really thinking like Paul Hogan, Crocodile Dundee with the hat and the corks. Like, crikey, we're here to do English linguistics today, and fighting a crocodile at the same time. So that would be my definition of a domestic Australian, for better or worse. But I mean, in our cohort, it's pretty much all imports. We've got the Europeans, myself and Martin. We got Japanese, we're Noriko. We got Vietnamese. We've got Taiwanese, and that's just in the kind of the core team, the permanent staff. But then we also have a very large cohort of so-called casual lecturers who do the majority of the teaching work. And they're from, again, Vietnam, China, all different kinds of places. So it's a really mixed cohort, and but they've all either come through the system themselves as former students and then come through and graduated and are with us as teachers, or they may be PhD students who are also teaching together with us and conducting research at the same time. So I think one of the really good things about Australia, as opposed to when I was at Hong Kong, for example, the teaching opportunities for research postgraduate students and PhD students, in that we generally get them to teach at least one or two courses throughout their cohort. And certainly I'm very heavily involved in getting them these kind of initial teaching qualifications as well. So like internationally recognized ones like the Higher Education Academy and so on. And so that by the time they finished and graduated, they've got a substantial amount of teaching experience and an internationally recognized teaching qualification. We're now also getting them to do internships for like research and work experience as well. This is like a relatively new thing that a lot of our PhD students now have to do as well. So that I do think that's a really excellent thing that we do here. That in like when I was in Hong Kong, for example, there was no teaching opportunities for PhD students at the center where I worked. So then when they graduated, they were not really as competitive as students who had that teaching background at university level, and they struggled to find work comparatively. So I think that's something that's pretty good. But yeah, I guess going back to the original question, like, it's hard to put your finger on what a domestic Australian is. I mean, we have one kind of born and bred Aussie, I guess, in Paul, but he's from New South Wales, so we don't really talk about him.
Yeah, we've one Kiwi as well with Mike Lahore, right? But otherwise, it's all international.
Kiwi, that's true, yeah. So we don't talk about him either.
Yeah, but that's really crazy. Like the teams in Australia are extremely diverse and international.
Very
also compared to Germany, where most of my colleagues were German.
There's a very good reason for this, and again, it goes back to the number of domestic students studying applied linguistics at higher levels, and they just don't exist. So then, obviously, then the number of the ability to get domestic Australian people to fill positions when the going in applied linguistics was good in Australia prior to COVID, you had to get imports who had the relevant kind of specialisms of things that you need. I was brought in for expertise on working with Chinese students and English corpus linguistics, and we could count the number of people in Australia who are doing English corpus linguistics on one hand, and they're all imports. You've got Monica Benderek in Sydney, who's German. You've got Martin. You've got myself, who's a Brit. Laurence, who's kind of joined us at the honorary level, and he's a Brit too. It's hard to find Aussies who are doing English corpus linguistics, so are not, because mostly the Aussies will be dealing with Indigenous language work. That's where they tend to end up.
Let me add real quick. So you have, of course, people like Pam Peters, right, and Adam Smith, or Kate Burridge and Simon Musgrave. So we have English linguists, proper English linguists there too. But it's different, right? So even you see within our university, because the linguistic staff, that's actually mostly domestic Australian. So with Felicity and Ilana and Katie Douglas. So there's a real split.
They're not doing English linguistics. They're doing.
That's true. Yeah.
That's true. So.
As a final point, I wanted to ask you about how you get your positions. Giving you the background of my question is, in Germany, you don't have a promotion system, right? So you apply for a position, and then you're basically in that position, and as you go older, you get pay rises. Whereas I know in Australia, it's quite different because we have a promotion system. So just for the international audience, I'd just like to ask you real quick, what's the system like in Australia, Peter?
Yeah, it's pretty much very, very similar to the one in the UK. So you'll come in at lecturer. You'll then have set criteria that you need to fulfill in order to be promoted to the next level, which would be senior lecturer, and then up to associate professor, and then full professor. But it's all done based on set criteria that you meet. So it's usually in the line of the four kind of criteria that you're annually appraised on. This will be teaching, research, service and citizenship, and supervision and supervisory development. So you'll be expected to be supervising PhD students. You'll have a good track record with that. They'll go on to do things. They'll go on to secure employment or research positions and so on. So that one. Service and citizenship usually involves taking some kind of major admin role, like a deputy head of school, director of research, or something along those lines. Teaching is teaching, so not much to explain there. And then research, you'll generally have to have a good track record of publications, grants, and so on to get you up into the next level of the system. But it's they don't kind of look. You don't have to check every single box. I mean, we work in the humanities, so obviously getting grants and funding in the arts and humanities in Australia is very challenging. There just isn't the same level of funding that you'll have, say, in the States or in China or so on. It's not very well resourced, and most of the funding will go on Indigenous language work rather than English linguistic work in Australia. That's the fact of life. So then you have to kind of excel in all of the other areas to get through. But generally, the process is very transparent, and you'll generally have a good indication of whether you're going to get through or not before you actually, like while you're in the process of making the application, because you'll be in discussions with your head of school, you'll be in discussions with maybe somebody on the board or so on to kind of see what your chances might be. I know this just because I served on the promotions and tenure committee for 2 years within my faculty, so I've seen and examined kind of people coming through who are quite from really diverse areas like music and politics, things like that. So yeah, it's all quite transparent. But if you know very much about the UK system, it's essentially the same thing.
Let me hand over to Laurence before we close off our panel and then turn to the Q&A. So Laurence, what's it like in Japan?
So just I'm trying to keep it quick. First, getting into, we've talked about university positions. So getting into a university position would require a PhD, not necessarily in English language or linguistics. It could be some kind of related, and that is very broadly related. So some people have even come into language and these kind of broad humanities fields from hardcore science, because the program might have an interest in science communication. So they may even hire a physicist or a chemist. We actually have a chemist on our team, and they have done research in linguistics or applied linguistics, but their background is pure chemistry. So that's basically, you need a PhD, and you need to have some kind of related interest that meets the needs of the department or the students. People usually will come in. A lot of faculty are hired internally, and this is just generally. I'm talking about generally across Japan. Most will come through some kind of undergraduate program, graduate. They get the PhD. They stay on as some kind of lecturer for a while, for 2 years. Then they get promoted to an associate professor, and then they get to a professor position. They may go through a lecturer, associate professor, or may have even assistant professor first, which is kind of, basically like a postdoc position, assistant professor, then maybe a lecturer or associate professor and professor. In terms of, so it sounds a little bit like what the situation is in Germany, I would kind of guess. I'm not sure exactly, but getting in is often quite challenging because you need to know the right people, or you need to either be a graduate from the university, or you have a very close connection with the needs or the interests of that department. Once you're in, generally speaking, there is no formal assessment of faculty in Japan. Generally speaking, not where we are. Generally speaking, there isn't, and basically you progress by age. Every year you get older, and every year you get a pay increase because of that age. At a certain time, people will feel it's the time to be promoted, and they may have a very, very arbitrary, very kind of surface level evaluation of your outputs up to that point. But I've seen people promoted with basically just 1 or 2 papers. So it depends on the person and the department. And as you get to 30, 40, 45, 50, it's like, oh, it's now time to become a professor, and you will get promoted that way. So that's generally, but in our university, and in my department, we've basically tried to adopt this kind of scheme that Peter was talking about, where we do have not annual assessments, but we certainly have assessment before people are promoted. And we tried to have a view of their teaching and supervision and grants and outputs. But it's over the top of a system, an actual official system that doesn't have any official evaluation process. So it's all kind of determined in-house. People will discuss the suitability of the person, and we have a numbered point system and so on, but it's basically on top of this much more general, feely kind of promotion scheme.
Just to correct, in Germany, there's no promotion system at all. You cannot be promoted in it.
But people in Germany can become from associate professor to professor, right?
If they apply for another position.
Well, in a different university or in the same university?
Typically in a different university.
Really? That's different to
Yeah.
us.
That's completely different, yeah.
But we don't call it, in some sense, it's not promotion at our place, though. We kind of, people put forward to be, well, we could call it a promotion, I suppose. It's a different, the position is, the position changes, and it would be considered a higher position.
Being wary of time, I think we have to stop here. I think it was really interesting because there's so drastic differences, right, between working in different countries. And we only touched upon that. When Peter said teaching is pretty much the same, I have to say that, again, it's completely different to where I came from, right? So I found this discussion really, really interesting. It's something that really fascinates me, what working in different countries is like, and how expectations are shattered when you move somewhere else sometimes. Before we move on to the Q&A, I'd just like to thank Peter and Laurence for taking part and being panelists, and for being open to being asked questions about the jobs and the wider landscape. Before we move on to the Q&A, I also would like to highlight two prizes that the IEL has announced just very recently, which is, let me share real quick, the teaching, the IEL Outreach Prize, or do you see the teaching prize at the moment?
Teaching Innovation Prize.
All right,
Teaching.
so I have them on top here of each other. So the Teaching Innovation Prize is there if you have a great teaching project, something that's innovative, that promotes the teaching of English language and linguistics. Please do apply. Basically describe what the project's like, and you might be eligible for the IEL Teaching Innovation Prize. Another prize that we have, it's also just out, so it's brand new, is the IEL Outreach Prize, and it's there for people who promote English linguistics and who have projects on basically creating outreach and taking initiative to basically spread the word. So if you have a project like that, please do apply. And yeah, we want to basically recognize people who basically engage and the public, or who have great ideas for teaching. So that just as a plug. And then let me stop the recording